Welcome to This Will Happen. It's been a brutal week for the Chinese Communist Party. For the first time in generations, the world is focused on the malign activities of the Chinese Communist Party and its activities not only at home in oppressing its own people, but how it's impacting the rest of the world. Its designs on world domination and controlling the world incrementally by controlling information, manipulating perceptions, even to the point of undermining international institutions such as the World Health Organization. This week, it was revealed that the head of the WHO is a lapdog of the Communist Party of China, who was only installed in his position after heavy-handed lobbying by Beijing. You would never think that a non-physician would head the WHO. The Chinese Communist Party made that possible and made sure that that happened. Dr. Tedros is living up and not disappointing his sponsors in Beijing by towing the Chinese Communist Party line. The Chinese Communist Party has had its sights set on world domination for over a generation now. It has been doing so quietly and discreetly, gathering information on Americans, hollowing out institutions, and espionage operations in this country, so they may go home and ultimately design products for companies that compete with America at best, and design weapons for the People's Liberation Army at worst. Chinese telecom companies seek to gather information and become enormous intelligence gathering machines, whether it's ZTE, who wants to underbid on telecom contracts, such that Americans, when they think in Los Angeles that they're calling their friends, those telephone calls are routed through Beijing, where all of that data is collected. China is seeking to control the world of 5G, with Huawei seeking to dominate that space. Make no mistake, all of these Chinese companies are agents of the Chinese government. Chinese law requires that all Chinese companies cooperate fully and proactively with the security services of the Chinese Communist Party. So there is no private sector, there is no dividing line between the private sector and the Chinese government. The coronavirus has only served as a fulcrum point upon which other countries are now actually waking up and seeing this. Will this result in a pivot point in the relationship between the rest of the world and China? Will the world writ large finally say enough's enough and force China, if it chooses to rejoin the community of nations, to modify its behaviors? Will China do what's necessary to protect the health of not only its own citizens, but those of the world? Stephen, I loved your book, The Bully of Asia. I urge everyone to read it. Get a copy. It's a must-have. Well, welcome, Stephen, to This Will Happen. It's great to have you here.
It's good to be here.
You know, to hear a lot of people talk as if nothing had been in the works or bad guys hadn't been active, I suspect, as the case with the regime in Beijing, is that they've been engaged in a lot of these activities for a long time.
People should constantly remind themselves of is that subsequent to the fall of the Soviet Union, the then Supreme Leader Deng Xiaoping, who held control of the reins of government after the Tiananmen massacre on June 4th, 1989, he called together the senior leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, and he said the old Cold War is over. America won the Cold War with the Soviet Union. The new Cold War is now beginning between the United States and China will win this one. So it's always good to remind ourselves that 29 years ago, China began a Cold War against the United States across all domains, except the kinetic. And now we know that it's not just the military domain, the economic domain, the trade domain, the intellectual property domain. It's now also the health domain, we might say, because the health and well-being is now of the American people is now at risk because of the unrestricted warfare of the Chinese Communist Party against the United States, with the clear goal, with the stated goal of replacing the United States as the dominant power on the planet. And we've been ignoring it. We've been pretending that China will eventually decide that our model is superior to theirs and they will simply be drawn along in our powerful wake. That's not going to happen.
Both inside of China and in the West, it seems that China is determined to manage information, to be able to monitor it, to control it, and to shape perceptions in a variety of ways, including infiltrating organizations as harmless as the NBA, Hollywood. We're looking at now 5G, telecom, and of course the World Health Organization, all in an effort to incrementally gain advantage against the United States, not in any bold stroke, but just incrementally, almost as a chess game, until you finally achieve chessmate. Would that be fair to say?
You know, chess is a fine game, and there's a Chinese version of it. But the real game that China is playing is the game of Go, where you win by encircling your opponent and cutting him off from any hope of retreat. And that's what China's been doing. I mean, I think Go is a perfect illustration of the kind of incremental encroachment that China's been making in the South China Sea, for example, and in other parts of the world. They do it step by step. They avoid, in general, open conflict. If they're resisted too strongly, they will retreat. But it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And I think everyone should bear in mind that Xi Jinping, who is very fond of quoting Chairman Mao, not too long ago quoted him by saying this. He said, the Chinese Communist Party has 3 magic weapons. The first magic weapon is the People's Liberation Army, which actually has the weapons. But the other 2 magic weapons are even more interesting in this context, because the second magic weapon is propaganda. And we know that they've been spending literally over the last few years $10 billion to expand their propaganda outreach around the world, buying up radio stations, TV stations, increasing their diplomatic presence in country after country. And the third magic weapon is united front tactics. And united front tactics involve going into an organization that may not be well disposed to you at the beginning and corrupting it. Like a parasite, hollowing out a host and converting it to its own purposes. So there you have the 3 magic weapons: the PLA, the military, the propaganda, and united front tactics. And we, really haven't seen this coming. And the very openness of America, which of course is built on openness and transparency, is being used against it as our institutions are compromised one by one. Great institutions, like some of our television networks, are now so heavily invested in China that they seem to have lost sight of the fact that they're Americans. China uses that very, very assiduously, very, very carefully, very cleverly to weaken the United States, especially in a kind of situation that we find ourselves in now.
Well, you're seeing a lot especially in the business press, Stephen, about Chinese telecom companies. I mean, obviously the biggest name is Huawei. Next is ZTE. And a lot of these companies have come into the United States and be a low bidder. And a lot of people make a phone call in Los Angeles, think they're calling their relative in Las Vegas, and the phone call is just routed between those 2 points, when in fact, oftentimes, it is actually routed through China, and that China is has built itself, a giant information gathering mechanism to which it can gather all manner of data, business applications, military applications, or ability to further their political influence operations in the United States. And the biggest, their flagship project right now is Huawei. And as a result of what we've seen in the last couple of weeks, you saw Huawei's been now banned from Australia. It's unlikely that Boris Johnson's sitting in his hospital bed being enthusiastic about the English decision to have Huawei build out the 5G network in England. How does the Ministry of State Security and the Chinese communist leadership intend to use all of this information?
Every which way they can to advance China's interest and China's determination to replace the United States as a dominant power in the world. You made reference to the 2017 intelligence law, which was passed, requiring every company in China to cooperate actively and proactively with the Ministry of State Security and with the Ministry of Public Security in order to gather data, not just on Chinese citizens, of course, but to the extent that these countries have international reach, and a lot of them do, to turn over all the data that they're collecting overseas as well. Last year I wrote a series on China's DNA collection efforts. They're in the business of collecting DNA from everybody in China. They started with the people in the far west. They started with the Tibetans and the Kazakhs and the Uyghurs because they don't trust them and they're committing a kind of cultural genocide now. But they're collecting DNA on everybody in China, and they're collecting actually much of the DNA that people turn into the major players in the U.S. DNA market. The DNA samples are actually sent to China to be analyzed. Where does that wind up? Well, that winds up on Chinese computers and artificial intelligence to create information banks of not just everybody in China, which would be impressive enough. I mean, that's 1.3 billion people, but key players from around the world, and as many people in the United States, especially people in the U.S. state and federal government as possible.
China has built a rising middle class and so much economic prosperity on its export-driven economic model. Let's say hypothetically that the world cracks down on China, that the political will develops in this country for President Trump to hold the line with regard to the trade conflict with China, and the rest of the world joins in. And this has internal economic impacts in China. To what extent is internal stability in China threatened?
Now you have, on top of that, you have the breaking down of the fundamental compact that the Chinese Communist Party made with the Chinese people after the Tiananmen massacre. Basically, the Chinese Communist Party for the last 30 years has said to the Chinese people, you may not like us, we violate your civil rights, you have no human rights, we violate the Constitution, which guarantees you freedom of speech, assembly, and so forth. But we're going to stay in power because you know that only we can guarantee you 5-10% economic growth every year. Only we can maintain a stable China and ensure economic growth. We legitimize our governments by holding elections. They legitimize themselves by performance, economic performance. And right now, that their legitimacy, which is based on performance, is not doing so well. You know, in the middle of the pandemic they did a survey of small and medium-sized businesses in China, and many of them said if the economy was closed down for more than a month, they would go out of business. So I think there's a lot of economic turmoil in China right now. We will see, I think, China having a hard time to maintain its economy in the years to come.
If the Chinese Communist Party is no longer able to deliver on its end of that, no longer able to deliver that type of economic growth because of its provocations with the rest of the world, because of the fallout from the virus and its malign activities around the world, if it's no longer able to hold up its end of the bargain, the Chinese regime relies basically on the threat of force, right?
Absolutely. I mean, look, the first reaction of the Chinese Communist Party to the epidemic in Wuhan on January 1st was to send in units of the People's Armed Police and to lock down the military bases in and around Wuhan. So their first reaction to any challenge, even if it's a health challenge, is to send in the military and the People's Armed Police. That is they're going to have to rely upon the military and the People's Armed Police to stay in power. Those are really the same thing, by the way, you know.
But it's worth pointing out here that the Chinese People's Liberation Army is a conscript force. Except at the officer level, even then at the senior officer, mid to senior level officer, it's not professional. Meaning people are conscripted, they're brought in farms, factories, they're just regular folks. To what extent, even if they're coming from another region and you start to see widespread brush fires of unrest, where is the breaking point of loyalty? At what point would the lower ranks of the People's Liberation Army break with the senior officers? At what point would they refuse to fire on their own people?
During the Tiananmen demonstrations, the Beijing garrison of the People's Liberation Army was unreliable. The people in the Beijing garrison had lived in Beijing for years. They may have had relatives, sons and daughters marching in the demonstrations, family members. And so they refused to carry out orders. And an army had to be brought in from the border region with Mongolia. And that was the army that was ordered to fire on unarmed demonstrators, and in fact did. They'd bring in an army from another province which had no local ties, and they're probably going to be more reliable because they don't know anyone in the Wuhan area, if the uprising were in Wuhan, for example.
Inside of China, obviously, we saw some more protests in Wuhan. The images from last summer in Hong Kong, are still very clear in many people's minds. To what extent is the Chinese Communist Party successful in controlling information and the perceptions of the Chinese people?
I think that a lot of people are very cynical about what they're told by the Chinese Communist Party, especially now that they were told that the epidemic in China was under control and that there are no new cases in China. The only ones that are being observed in China are imported by those terrible foreigners who bring the coronavirus with them when they come into Beijing. For anyone who understands that there are still long lines at Chinese hospitals in different cities, that there are still lots of people in ICU beds with undiagnosed pneumonia, which is in most cases the coronavirus. They understand the Chinese Communist Party is lying about this too. It's not just the United States that has fake news. Everything coming from the Chinese Communist Party is fake news designed to make the party look good. The head of the China's National Health Commission was quoted as saying, our priorities are politics first, and then it's quarantine second, and it's finding a cure third. Politics first means that you must protect the reputation of the Chinese Communist Party at all costs and do nothing to harm the party. I think there's a lot of cynicism in China, but there's also a saying in China that when 4 people are together, you tell lies about the Chinese Communist Party. When 3 people are together, you tell jokes about the Chinese Communist Party. And only when 2 people are together and you trust the other person do you actually tell the truth about what you believe about the party and its management of the Chinese economy and politics and everything else.
The world's attention is focused on Chinese activities. The secretive handling of the coronavirus and its cost to the world economy, now the public exposure of its infiltration of the World Health Organization, really have brought some of these to the fore. Does China see these exposures as a setback?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's why the propaganda effort has gone into overdrive. Just today, the Global Times said that the United States is becoming a slaughterhouse of victims of the China virus. Xi Jinping made it clear that China was facing a very, very difficult time over the next few months and years because of what he called the New World situation. The level of anger, I think, against China is rising with every day that we're in quarantine, with every day that we see a business close from the virus that the Chinese Communist Party unleashed on the world.
The rest of the world is rallying against China. That is going to cost them dearly when businesses and supply chains start to migrate out of China, and that the whole house of cards is at least under threat of coming down. At what point would members of the party, or perhaps of the military, launch some sort of coup, but within the Communist Party context?
I tend to think there's tremendous discontent with Xi Jinping dating back before the China virus. He disobeyed the command laid down by Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping said in the 1990s, we have to bide our time and hide our capabilities. In other words, we have to play the long game. We have to hide our capabilities from the United States so that the United States doesn't understand that we are a threat to them, that we want to replace them as the dominant power on the planet. And what we began hearing even 3 years ago, certainly, after Trump took office, is that Xi Jinping, whose primary job is to not roil the waters where the United States is concerned, so China continue to steal technology, devalue its currency, force American companies to hand over cutting-edge technology, all the other ways they cheat, that he was being accused of having lost America because he made China's ambitions too evident to the United States. And in reaction, we moved in the direction of imposing tariffs on Chinese goods. We've gotten serious in our national security. It's hard to know when these systems reach the breaking point because they appear so resilient and so long-lasting from the outside, right? Like a diamond. But like a diamond, you can shatter a diamond with a hammer blow delivered with just the right force at just the right angle. Who would have expected the Soviet Union to collapse? Xi Jinping's China dream of world domination is over. I think the rule of the Chinese Communist Party may well be over as well. And that would be the best thing that could possibly happen to the Chinese people, who certainly deserve better than the tyranny, the tyrannical one-party dictatorship that's ruled them for the last 70 years and cost tens of millions of lives of the Chinese people. They're the first and foremost victims of not just the Wuhan flu, but the Chinese Communist Party itself.
Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an illuminating, a great insight into a really remarkable time. In fact, one could even argue is a pivotal moment in Sino-American relations. In fact, a historical hinge point between China and the rest of the world. The coronavirus has laid bare a lot of truths which have been behind the scenes and hidden for a lot of years and only reported by yourself and a few other very courageous writers and journalists. But now it looks like the world is listening. Thank you, Stephen. The rule of the Chinese Communist Party may not be as secure as many observers would have us believe. The Communist Party's ability to control information inside of China isn't as absolute as we all thought. Chinese are becoming disillusioned with their leadership, disappointed with their economic performance, concerned about their future, economically, politically, and now in terms of their own health. The Chinese Communist Party is losing credibility inside of China, not only there, but around the world with regard to its continuous deceptions and falsehoods with regard to the coronavirus. Are the Chinese people becoming disillusioned? Well, I'm John Jordan. Goodbye and thanks for watching This Will Happen, where we embrace the challenge of looking into an uncertain future and know that freedom, respect, and prosperity are for everyone.